Good evening, everyone. Nice to be here again. And thank you, Eamon. Tour de force as usual. I could have listened to him for the full 2 hours. I'm sure you're totally in agreement with that as well. But we are where we are. What I'd like to say at the start, people are going to talk about their personal experience. I was too young. Okay, I was 11, I think, when you can work it all out. 60, just turned 62. When all of this started. But I do vividly remember the shock of what we saw on the television. And I was brought up in Carrickfergus and going to school in Methody in Belfast, and my parents worried sick, putting this little child onto the bus and sending him off, and what was going in mad Belfast. Carrick's pretty mad as well, let me tell you. 20 minutes or so, we've been told, which in church history terms we're told is just about as long as people can bear for a sermon. So here we go. When did it all start with the churches? Arguably with Moses. Moses confronting the Pharaoh, let my people go, and all of that. You can think of the sermons you could have on that. But the churches in Irish history have a patchy existence, let me say. I'm still tickled by this little cartoon I once got in a British Airways magazine. My speciality in church history is the patristic era, Christians in the amphitheatre in Rome. And here are the lands coming to kill the Christians. And the lands are saying to each other, oh no, not the Irish Christians, because they're knocking bells out of each other already. And it sort of sums up all of Irish history in one cartoon, I thought. The other thought that the Americans are always telling us sums up our Irish history is Ireland, the land. I can't do American accents, I can't do any accent. The land of saints and scholars. But it really all goes way back to, 5th to the 8th century, the kingdom of Dalriada and all of that, and maybe Columba, who died in 597. But don't worry, I'm not going to do the run-in from there up to Burntullet. That would be too big of a stretch. But we do have problems with our church history and the role of the churches. The European Reformation, Martin Luther nailing his famous 95 Theses to the church door in Wittenberg, which, by the way, was not an act of protest. Just to get it in now, Ian Paisley got his doctorate, half of it for one lecture on this incident, and he vividly described it as Luther with the nails in his mouth and the hammer in his hand, like the Pied Piper walking down the main street of Wittenberg, and the people saying, what's the mad monk doing now? And he walked up to the Catholic church door and he banged it in as a protest. And actually the church door was the notice board for the university, and what he nailed up was in Latin, which most people couldn't read. And he was asking for a debate in the university, which never took place. So it's actually been built up. The myth of it, this is one of our problems with our history. But anyway, the failed Protestant Reformation in Ireland is a little ticking time bomb that is still here with us, because actually 3 streams came out of that. In the year of the penal laws, there were 75% of the population were Catholic, 12% of the population were Anglican and established, and 12% of the population were dissenter, mainly Presbyterian, stuck in the middle. And everybody sort of discriminating against everyone in some ways, I suppose. And this Protestant Catholic and dissenter, which we've sort of lost coming up to the beginning of the 20th century, it's been Protestant Catholic really. The churches really often have, and here's my fancy notes I have to read, served as badges of ethno-political identity. And that continues to this day to impede the relations even between the churches. Because at the end of the day, the churches are in competition with each other. The churches are the leaders, but the churches are also the people at grassroots. And there's all sorts of things to think out. But I've got to move on to get up into the present, and the 20th century at least. And one of the little examples of our bad relations running into this is Pius X's Natamir decree, effective in Easter 1908, that mixed marriage, we know what a mixed marriage is, it's not 2 men or 2 women or a man and a woman, it's all changed. Protestant Catholic marriage is only valid if the priest is present and giving his blessing or performing the ceremony. Incorrectly, I think that the children had to be raised as Catholics. That's controversial, and I'm not actually certain about it. But the cause célèbre, of course, was Alexander McCann, a Catholic, who married on the 16th of May 1908 Agnes McCann, a Presbyterian. Her minister married them in Antrim, High Street Presbyterian Church. Their first child was baptised a Presbyterian. They came to live in the Falls Road area, where the mixed marriage people lived in Belfast at that time. And allegedly, again controversially perhaps to some extent or not, the local priest started to quote this decree and got into the head of Alexander, The second child was baptised a Catholic against the mother's wishes. The mother tried to protest at the service and was expelled. The relationship certainly deteriorated by October 1910, and then when Agnes was out of the house, Alexander disappeared with the children, and Agnes never saw the children again. We know now he and the children went to Canada with help. But you can imagine, and certainly her Presbyterian minister, Corky and Townsend Street, made much of this, and there were rallies and petitions in Belfast and in Dublin and in Edinburgh and Glasgow, and people were protesting up and down, and it fed into the home rule is Rome rule. Here's an example of what it'll be like. West Belfast MP Joseph Devlin believed this rallies and the things were all a plot because it was all organised in Belfast 5 days before the December 1910 election, although he held his seat with a majority of 463, and Eamon will keep me right, I think it was Boyd Carpenter, Liberal Unionist candidate, that he beat. But the crisis, the Home Rule crisis, and the third bill and all of that led to an increasing Protestant, on the Protestant side, a coming together of the Protestant churches to a certain extent, and a common cause of fear against Catholicism, a real fear factor for many of the Protestants. And at this time, in 1905, there was a joint Presbyterian Methodist committee set up that they would start talking to each other. In 1911, a joint Presbyterian Church of Ireland committee. The committees didn't speak to each other. I mean, it's in your cubicle, in your room, to encourage, I quote, the cultivation of friendly relations between the churches and to cooperate in philanthropic, social and religious work as far as such cooperation may be found feasible. The main success coming out of this was in education. The churches started to speak together. They demanded the full amount claimed by the Commissioners of National Education for Irish education, on a par with English and Scottish schools. And of course, another topic the churches are very fond of cooperating on, and that is temperance. They actually got a joint letter off to Lloyd George in March 1915 on temperance, that the government need to do something. Too much drink in Ireland. This tickles me. I have a feeling it's American, but it's one of the propaganda posters. Lips that touch liquor shall not touch ours. Now, I want to be very sexist. Men, would you want to touch any of the liquor? But anyway, that's another question. I'm just sort of teasing and probably going to get run out of the county for pictures like this. But anyway, let us move on. A few of the books I've read have said, the churches didn't really get involved in politics. Well, I'm going to confess, I think on the Protestant side they did. The Ulster Covenant Day, 28th of September 1912, largely supported by the Protestant churches. Lots of these churches opened their halls for the signing of the covenant. The Presbyterian Church did insist that in the wording of the covenant that the opposition was to be limited to the present crisis only. They wouldn't sign a blank cheque for unending opposition. That was salving their conscience, I think, maybe in some way. But let me give you some examples of some of the issues, because it's easy to gloss over and generalise. And always there is the devil in the detail. The devil, what a word to use, the church history. But the devil is in the detail always. For example, in May Street Presbyterian Church, the Reverend William Patterson, who had come from Canada throughout the crisis, the Ulster Covenant crisis and the Home Rule crisis, had a huge Union Jack fixed to the wall behind his pulpit. And he preached, well, you can imagine what he was preaching through the crisis, very anti-Home Rule. However, the Reverend John Waddell, who later was to become a moderator from Fisherwick Church as a young minister in First Bangor, refused to have his hall open to have the covenant signed. He took a conscientious stand in that. He says, that's politics. I'm a minister of religion. Let's keep the two separate. And he faced such local opposition afterwards that he had to leave. He had to go to England for a number of years. Now, he was forgiven and worked his way back, coming back, as I say, and eventually becoming moderator. And of course, the famous James Armour of Ballymoney, who dared to call Ulster Day Protestant Fool's Day and asked one of the ultimate religious questions at the General Assembly in 1913, first week of June always, and he got up and he was mocking the Presbyterians who were, as he saw, headlong, careering over the cliff following the political agenda. And he said, what are you going to say to me if I told you God wants a united Ireland? And he painted a picture to them of the plantation and all these Scottish Presbyterians coming over from Scotland and settling in the northeast. And he says, what if God wants United Ireland to make you scatter and spread your pure gospel through the whole island? And that question has still not been answered. It was a very potent theological question on the church's side, but it's buried. And said, oh, you're a nutcase. We not listen to you. There are problems all around. Cardinal Logue here, we have here, the Catholic primate 1887 to 1924. For example, publicly supported the principle of Irish Home Rule throughout his long reign, both in Raphoe and Armagh, although often wary of the motives of individual politicians pushing that issue. And he also maintained a loyal attitude to the British Crown during the First World War. Here he is with the King and Queen at Maynooth on the 19th of June 1917. And here he is being used for recruitment purposes. In the north they talked about poor little Belgium. Why don't you go and fight in the First War? In the south it was poor little Catholic Belgium to try and increase. So there are all sorts of little bits and pieces running with this. Cardinal Logue again, just some examples I was looking up because I'm not so up to speed with that side of the history. Because of so many of his younger clergy taking part and obviously supporting Sinn Féin, he issued what he called his instruction, calling attention to the teaching of the church as to the obedience due to legitimate authority and warning the clergy against belonging to what he called dangerous associations, reminding priests that it was strictly forbidden by the statutes of the National Synod to speak of political or kindred affairs in the church. And yet he took a very public stand against the threat of conscription being introduced in Ireland towards the end of the war, and he did arrange an electoral pact between the Irish Parliamentary Party and Sinn Féin in at least 3 constituencies in Ulster, and chose a Sinn Féin candidate in South Fermanagh, the imprisoned Republican John O'Mahony. So, and he was also a pro-Anglo-Irish treaty in 1921. So the church leaders are involved in politics. We live in the real world. I'm a church leader. We live in the real world. I just promoted myself there. Live in the real world, but their natural habitat is in their churches and in their pulpits and leading their people. Partition changed Ireland, of course. 1922, 2 states are created on the island of Ireland, the south, with Dominion status, becoming a republic with overwhelming a Catholic majority of 90% plus of the population. The north part of the UK, resistant to independent Ireland, with a Protestant majority of about 65 to 35, so a different scenario, but both states brought about by force of arms. The main churches, has to be said, remained all Ireland institutions. And that's a complication you've got to bear in mind in looking at all of this. The Catholic primate of all Ireland, Eamon Martin, has his see in Armagh, in Northern Ireland. The Anglican stipends are paid from Dublin, and the clergy claim tax rebates from the British Exchequer. You could only do it in Ireland, but it works. The Church of Ireland churches have diocesan and parochial organisations over the whole island, and church organisations ignore the border because the border runs through dioceses, presbyteries, circuits, etc. Also in this year, a United Council of Christian Churches. We think the unionist politicians come up with these things. The churches were there first. The United Council of Christian Churches was established in 1922. What did that result in? Well, not very successful. In the 1930s, the Presbyterians and the Anglicans talked about an organic union. Could these 2 churches unite for the benefit of Ireland? And they had lots and lots of talks, 40 clergy on each side talking about this reunion. It broke down because the Anglicans would never acknowledge Presbyterian ordination. You have to be ordained by one of their bishops, so they don't recognise Presbyterian ordination, therefore their marriage and communions and everything is invalid. They next had to go to unite with the Methodists. This is the Presbyterians again, trying to talk to the Methodists. And this broke down over itinerancy. The Presbyterians liked their wealthy manses and their big stipends, and the Methodists were moving around every 5 or 7 years, and even the knives, forks and spoons were signed for in their manses, and the Presbyterians were not going to give up and go for that. So it all, I'm afraid, broke down. All I can say about the church relations is there were some good personal relationships emerged at a local level. This Irish Council eventually morphed, by the way, into the Irish Council of Churches in 1966, much easier to talk about. And in that same year, they produced a very important report on discrimination, which I'll say something about maybe a little bit later. The situation began to change with Vatican II, John the 23rd, the decree on ecumenism, which runs to about 7,000 words, where for the first time the Catholic Church is saying in religious terms, we believe the Holy Spirit is active in other churches. Our separated brethren This was the beginning of a thaw. This is the beginning of not a coming together, but at least, as I say, a thaw, and we're not going to demonise each other. Now, it hasn't worked for everyone, of course, but that's, I think, a significant marker in the process. From 68 to 88, on the Protestant side, the Presbyterians, the Methodists, the Anglicans, all entered what they called their tripartite talks, but it all waned in the 70s. I'll say something about that too in a moment. Burntullet. Now, I'm so young I hardly remember it. I've got a picture of Bernadette in here, 4th of January 1960. I understand there are people here tonight who were there, so I'm not going to lecture on this. But I know the horror of an attack on people who are exercising their democratic right to protest. I understand that absolutely perfectly. And the press expressing their condemnation of that. The Prime Minister, the Church has asked the Prime Minister to bring in a judicial inquiry of the causes of the unrest and all of that. The Cameron Commission, of course, comes out of this eventually. And Cardinal Conway at the time suggests, the churches in their joint council for the first time said, let's make overtures to the Catholic side. We've really got to realise that we're all Christians and we've got to say something for our society that seems to be on the verge of a major meltdown. And so Cardinal Conway was asked, would you be up for a joint consultation? And he very positively welcomed the possibility of that consultation. And we went through very shaky times. Eamon has outlined this. There's William Conway here. The tripartite talks are running, and then this joint consultation asking for the talks that they would have together. The dodgy, shaky regime of Terence O'Neill, with his policies of reform that horrified so many of his own supporters, overthrown as Prime Minister by his supposed friends on the 1st of May 1969, and the Irish Council of Church, people welcoming the fact that his successor, Major James Chichester Clark, I think a distant cousin as well, had committed himself to pursue the same policy of reform and called upon the churches prophetically, use the next 12 months to act constructively. That's what the church leaders were saying to each other at this time. A couple of comments in this as it has emerged. Church leaders everywhere always condemn violence. They have to. Turn the other cheek. Love your enemy. Love God first and foremost, and love your neighbour as yourself. Surely sums up the purity of Christianity. So church leaders will always condemn violence, but tribal reactions from the people are always there. And the leaders are always wary of getting so far ahead with their theological ideas and drift from their followers that they get cut off, and they're always worried about that. So the edicts from the church leaders are not always followed or obeyed. There's a delicate path that has to be there. And in this situation, again, I'm just saying it very generally on the way past, so often the Protestant leaders in their pronouncements are supporting the police and the army, and the Catholic leaders are tending to highlight the rough treatment of Catholic people in their areas by the same police and the army, and everyone condemning murder, and everyone asserting the right to life. Really difficult. On the church side, big step forward was the Ballymascanlon talks, Ballymascanlon Hotel at Drogheda, initiated on the 26th of September 1973. About 90 representatives of what we call the four main churches in Ireland met in Ballymascanlon Hotel at Dundalk. The first meeting was chaired by Cardinal William Conway and Archbishop George Otto Sims, the Anglican. It was a safe agenda. Papers were prepared, but for the first time each side said, let's have comments for what they called comments from the other side that we will respectively listen to. This is the beginning of dialogue. This is the beginning of churches, at least among themselves even, talking to each other and listening to each other. Papers were prepared on scripture and the authority and the theories of the church, social and community problems, baptism, Eucharist and marriage, and finally Christianity and secularism. Working parties were set up. The progress was painfully slow, but the positives that came out of it were personal relationships were established between some key individuals. Some of the things that have come out of this, the Week of Christian Unity, every January, how important is that in our society? It splits lots of congregations, lots of churches on both sides. Some are for it, some are enthusiastic and say, this is something we should do. It's a scandal we don't talk or respect each other better, and others say, it's the last thing we're going to do. They're not real Christians. We will keep our distance. It suits us. Some of the controversies in this I want to put in. This man has got to be mentioned. The fundamentalism. This man had the knack of that pithy saying, of plain speech, of pulling the rug from under everyone else. I was personally present, and I was young. I was, 11, 12, when he came into Carrick Harbour on the bridge of the Clyde Valley, gun-running boat. December 1968, 4,000 people were there in the quayside. I remember it. I just remember being fascinated with this, and this man who commanded abject worship almost from the people, and he was playing on the history, and he was the one who would save Ulster, and all of that was put into it. The influence of Ian Paisley to this day in the main churches, and certainly in the Presbyterian church, is enormous. And the elephant in the room, the thing that is not openly brought out at the General Assembly certainly, or discussed in many of the churches, is the place of the Orange Order. This is the Reverend Alistair Smith of Carrickduff. This is the elephant in the room. All the prime ministers were members of the Orange Order. Lots of the Protestant church leaders were members of the Orange Order. It's not brought out and talked about. Is there a conflict? Is there a need? I know there may be Orange men here tonight, or Orange women, I do not know. I'm not trying to offend anybody. But I'll nail my colours, I'd be in the camp where I would say, do we need an organisation that claims to be religious and all that if we've got a church? Is it a church within a church, or a parachurch, or what is it? I don't really know, and I don't understand. So you can fill me in on that one after, or fill him in and he'll tell me. Other notable things just to pass, the fecal talks. I do remember this, 10th of December 1974, and the church leaders talked secretly but directly to IRA leaders. They then met Merlin Rees, the Secretary of State. This is like an all our yesterdays, always on the 18th of December. There is a one-page note that survives of their meeting with Harold Wilson, released in 2006 in public records documents. And the result was an IRA ceasefire from the 22nd of December 74 to the 2nd of January 75. Here opens up something very important. Whether they deserve credit, I think they probably do. How much the whole churches as a whole need the credit, the possibility of dialogue. I put the picture of Jack Weir up, who was the first officer of the Presbyterian Church, the clerk of the General Assembly, clerk of the church. And when he died, Jerry Adams said of him, this man was sensible and courageous. I thought that's quite an epitaph. I am nearly finished, I promise you. What has happened since then? Here are the current church leaders. I put this picture up. Brian Anderson on the left, from the left, Secretary of the Irish Council of Churches. Eamon Martin, Catholic Primate. Richard Clark, looking very cool, the Anglican Primate. Chief Superintendent Sam Wells, I think the man's name is. Charles McMullen, the Presbyterian Moderator. Billy Davison, the Methodist President. Would you have been able to name them? Could anyone in this room tell us what their message was for the new year in January? How relevant are the church leaders? I showed this to a student a couple of days ago, this picture. I was looking for a contemporary picture, and he said they all look like they've been caught speeding and they're getting there, and they've been told that they're going a course. Oh dear. Students. How important are the churches? What is their part? What are the prospects? I think all the churches in our day, really in our society, are worried about the future because there's people power. I see it in little things. Let me throw out one silly example. Funerals. I mean, undertakers are never out of business, are they? There are always people dying. Funerals. And more in all denominations, families are taking more part. They're saying, we have a poem we want to say something. It used to be you sat back and you let the professional clergy do everything. Our society is changing. There is more people power, and all the churches like control, and all the churches are to a certain extent threatened, and all the churches to a certain extent are declining. Tenuous link. Father Brown. Last picture of the Titanic as she left Cove in the south of Ireland, Queenstown. Then. It was a mathematical certainty the ship would sink once she was hauled to the 4th and 5th compartment. As the water poured in, it went over the bulkheads, which didn't go right to the top of the ceiling, And as the weight of the water pulled the ship nose down, the water poured over successive. It was a mathematical certainty she would sink. And I'd be very provocative and ask the question, are the churches in Ireland like a Titanic? Is it a mathematical certainty they're going down? This Presbyterian statistic is, for the last 20 years, average loss is 3,900 people a year. That's sinking. I did the statistic, I've forgotten the year, it's like 2069 or something, the last Presbyterian puts a light out in Church House. It works like that. Not the last census, but the 2011 census. The statistic, that was not a good one to put up. This is the Catholic Church, this is the Presbyterian Church, this is the Anglican Church. These sectors are all shrinking. This is the big growth one, no religion. It's only 10%, but it's growing really, really fast. Churches are looking over their shoulders, and so I finish with the prospects for the Irish churches coming, everyone together. There are lots of individuals, and lots of individuals have done marvellous things to cross the divide. But as a whole, the churches, I would say, I would describe the process of their involvement with change and that, it's driving with a handbrake on. Because so often the churches are inward looking and they're just concerned with functioning their great organisation and engine and keeping it ticking over and really not engaging with each other and with the wider society. I'm sorry that's very negative, but I throw it out, and if you've got any questions about it, Eamon will be very happy to answer them.